The night Senna's heart began its final stutter. 63 souls stood in the grand hall of Arranmore, dressed in ceremonial white, and not one of them knew they were about to witness the most controversial claiming in 7 centuries. The hall itself seemed to breathe, its ancient stone walls sweating with the heat of too many bodies pressed beneath vaulted ceilings, carved with the old mating prayers that had not been answered for the king who stood at their center in 7 long, solitary years. Candles lined every alcove, their flames bending in unison each time the massive oak doors opened to admit another hopeful candidate, another noble daughter groomed since girlhood for this exact moment, trained to bare her neck with practiced grace and whisper the old words of offering. The air was thick with competing perfumes, jasmine and amber and night looming Sirius, each woman's scent carefully chosen to entice, to promise, to claim attention from the one man in the room who had never once been moved by any of it. King Kadron stood on the raised stone dais at the far end of the hall, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression arranged into the same mask of patient authority he had worn at every one of these ceremonies since his coronation. He was enormous in the way of his bloodline, broad across the shoulders and tall enough that the ceremonial silver circlet on his brow caught the light of chandeliers that other men stood beneath without effort. His jaw was set. His eyes, the color of winter slate, moved across the procession of women with the careful, clinical attention of a man cataloging threats rather than choosing a bride. No one in the room. Not his first advisor, Alluren, who stood at his left with a registry scroll. Not the 12 council alphas arranged in a crescent behind the dais. Not the hopeful women who had traveled weeks to stand before him. None of them understood why he had refused every candidate for 7 years. None of them knew the truth his private physicians had confirmed when he was 21. The diagnosis his father had ordered buried so deep that only 3 living souls carried its weight. Kadron's bloodline was not singular. Somewhere in the royal lineage, a mating had occurred that should not have been possible. A union between 2 fundamentally incompatible supernatural bloodlines that had produced, generations later, him. A king whose bond architecture was so compromised by competing biological imperatives that a standard-claiming bond, the kind every alpha in this room could form as easily as breathing, would trigger a cascading rejection in his system. In blunt terms, the bond would eat him alive. Every woman in this hall, healthy, whole, their bond marks clean and ready, was a loaded weapon pointed at his chest. He attended the ceremonies because tradition demanded it. He refused every candidate because survival required it. And he told no one the reason, because a king without the ability to bond was a king whose throne existed on borrowed time, and borrowed time only worked if no one knew the loan was due. What he did not know, what no one in that glittering hall of ambition and perfume and ancient stone could possibly have anticipated, was that the answer to his impossible biology was not among the 62 women who had come to be chosen. It was in the 63rd body, the one being carried through the servants' entrance at that very moment, wrapped in a threadbare cloak that smelled of blood and failure, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of a bond mark eating its host from the inside out. Senna had stopped counting the hours sometime after they loaded her into the cart. Time had become a slippery thing, a fish she could feel brushing against her palms but could not grip, and so she let it go and focused instead on the only sensation that remained consistent, the slow, grinding burn radiating from the mark on her left shoulder. It had been 3 days since Vorath had stood before their entire pack, his chin high, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man discussing weather rather than execution, and spoken the words of formal rejection. 3 days since he had looked at her with those amber eyes she had once believed held tenderness and said, "I release this bond. I release this woman. She is no longer claimed. no longer mine, no longer Pack. Let her walk where she will. Let her fate be her own. The words were ancient, the ritual was sanctioned, and the biological reality was a death sentence that every wolf in attendance understood, even if none of them had the decency to object. A mating bond, once formed, was not a promise. It was a physiological event. It rewired the nervous system, restructured the hormonal cascade that governed shifting, laced itself into the architecture of the heart and lungs and marrow. To sever it was not like breaking a contract. It was like removing a load-bearing wall from a house and expecting the roof to hold. Cinna's roof was collapsing. She could feel it in the way her heartbeat had become irregular, skipping and stuttering like a bird with a broken wing, trying to maintain altitude. She could feel it in the way her wolf, that second consciousness that had lived behind her ribs since she was 14, had gone quiet, not sleeping but retreating, pulling back from the edges of their shared body, as if trying to minimize the damage of the collapse. She could feel it most of all in the mark itself, Vorath's mark, the crescent of scar tissue on her shoulder that had once hummed with warmth and was now radiating a cold so deep it felt like her bones were being packed in ice. A rejected bond mark did not simply fade. It decayed, and as it decayed, it pulled the host's vital energy into the void it left behind, a biological sinkhole that would drain her until there was nothing left to drain. She had perhaps 12 hours, maybe less. The healers in the border settlement where she had collapsed had told her as much, their faces careful, their hands gentle, their eyes holding the particular species of pity reserved for someone already dead. One of them, an older woman with gray-streaked hair and hands that smelled of comfrey, had suggested bringing her to the capital for the claiming ceremony. Not as a candidate, the very idea was absurd. An Omega with a decaying bond mark, packless, powerless, her wolf retreating and her body failing. No. She had been brought as a demonstration, a political prop, evidence of what the border pack alphas were willing to do to their own people when the crown looked the other way. Senna had agreed because agreement and refusal had become equally meaningless concepts. She was dying. The location was irrelevant, and if her death could be made useful, if the last exhale of her failing lungs could purchase even a moment of royal attention for the people she was leaving behind, then let it be here, on cold stone, beneath chandeliers she would never have been permitted to stand under while healthy. Let it be useful. Let her be useful. It was, she thought, with the dark humor that had become her only companion in the past 3 days, the most she had ever been asked to contribute to her species. They carried her in through the servants' corridor and laid her on a bench near the kitchens, and she could hear the ceremony proceeding in the hall beyond, the herald's voice calling names, the rustle of silk, the murmur of the crowd. She closed her eyes and felt her heartbeat stutter again, a longer pause this time, and her wolf pressed against the inside of her ribs once, softly, like a hand placed on a window in farewell. The first 40 candidates had been presented and politely refused when Alluren leaned close to Kadron's ear and murmured something about a disruption near the service entrance. Kadron did not react visibly. He had perfected the art of receiving information without betraying its impact, a skill that had kept him alive through 3 assassination attempts and 1 particularly creative poisoning. But his nostrils flared. Beneath the layered perfumes and the smoke of ceremonial herbs, and the sharp tang of anxious perspiration from 62 hopeful women, something else had entered the building. It was faint, almost drowned by the competing scents, but it hit the back of his throat like a swallow of ice water, sharp and wrong, and underneath the wrongness, something else. Something his rational mind could not immediately categorize, but that his body responded to with a sudden, savage alertness. His wolf, the second consciousness he had spent his adult life suppressing to prevent the very bond loss that would kill him, lifted its head for the first time in years. Not stirred, lifted. Rose from the enforced dormancy Kadron had maintained since the diagnosis, and pressed against the inside of his skull with an urgency that bordered on pain. Kadrin's jaw tightened. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, but his fingers had gone white at the knuckles. He continued to receive candidates. He refused each one with the same measured courtesy, and between each refusal he breathed in again, searching for that thread of scent, that cold, sharp wrong and something underneath note that was making his suppressed wolf claw at the walls of its cage with a ferocity he had not felt since the day he had locked it away. By the 52nd candidate, he could not maintain the pretense. He stepped down from the dais, which produced a ripple of shocked murmurs through the hall, and told Alluren he required a moment. Alluren, who had served 3 kings and prided himself on managing the unmanageable, opened his mouth to protest. Kadrin silenced him with a look that was not entirely human, his irises ringed with a faint luminescence that should not have been possible given his years of suppression, and walked toward the service corridor with the measured stride of a man who was absolutely not running, while every cell in his body screamed at him to do exactly that. He found her on the bench near the kitchens. 2 healers hovered nearby, their faces drawn, their hands hovering uselessly over a body that was clearly beyond their intervention. A minor nobleman stood with them, a sheaf of papers in his hand, a prepared speech about border pack abuses dying on his lips as the King of Arranmore appeared in the servants' corridor with glowing eyes and an expression that cleared the hallway in seconds. Kadrin stopped 3 feet from the bench. He looked down at the woman lying on it, and every clinical, rational thought he had cultivated in 7 years of careful survival went silent. She was small, that was the first thing. Small in a way that had nothing to do with height, and everything to do with the way her body had turned inward, curling around the wound on her shoulder as if trying to contain a detonation. Her hair was dark, matted with sweat and what he recognized as dried blood, not from an external wound, but from the capillary ruptures that accompanied bond decay. Her skin, where it was visible beneath the threadbare cloak, had the translucent quality of paper held over a candle, and he could see the network of veins beneath it, blue and laboring. Her heartbeat was audible to him, irregular, slowing. And the mark on her shoulder, visible where the cloak had slipped, was a nightmare. It was not simply decaying, it was being consumed, the scar tissue blackening at the edges, the skin around it mottled with a distinctive bruising pattern that indicated not natural bond deterioration, but active drainage. Someone was pulling energy through that mark. Someone was using the severed bond as a siphon, drawing out whatever remained of this woman's life force through the very wound they had inflicted. Kadrin had seen bond decay. He had studied it extensively, given that his own biological architecture was a catastrophe of competing bond mechanics. What he was looking at was not decay. It was harvest. And in the space between one stuttering heartbeat and the next, the clinical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive by understanding exactly what his compromised bloodline could and could not survive, performed a calculation so fast and so instinctive that he would only fully understand what he had done hours later. Her bond mark was failing, collapsing. The architecture it had built inside her was disintegrating, which meant the receptor sites, the biological anchors where a bond attached to a host system, were open, exposed, and empty. Not clean empty, like an unbonded wolf. Damaged empty, shattered empty. The kind of empty that could not support a standard bond because there was nothing left to attach to. Which meant, with the terrible precision of 2 broken keys that fit no other lock, she was the only woman he had ever encountered whose bond architecture was too damaged to trigger the cascading rejection that made claiming lethal for him. Her system could not overwhelm his because her system was barely functioning. His system could not destroy hers because his compromised bloodline produced a bond formation so attenuated, so reduced by the competing imperatives in his blood, that it was too weak to be lethal, but might be strong enough to seal the wound that was killing her. He did not ask permission. There was no time. Her heart was spacing its beats now, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5. And her wolf, he could feel it somehow, a sensation he had no framework for. Her wolf was letting go, releasing its grip on the body it shared, preparing for the final separation. Kadrin knelt beside the bench. He pulled the cloak from her shoulder. He placed his mouth over the blackened, decaying mark left by the man who had rejected her, and he bit down. The pain was extraordinary. Cinna's eyes flew open, and for a moment, she existed in a place beyond language, beyond thought, a white-hot landscape of sensation that obliterated everything she had been and everything she was becoming. The cold that had been eating her from the shoulder outward met something else, something that was not warmth exactly, but was anti-cold, a negation, a cancellation, as if someone had poured a substance into the void that did not fill it but neutralized its pull. She screamed, or she thought she screamed. The sound that came out of her was something between a gasp and a keen, and it was answered by a low, resonant growl from the man whose teeth were buried in her shoulder. A sound so deep it vibrated in her sternum and traveled down her spine and reached her wolf, her retreating, surrendering wolf, and stopped it. Not healed it, not restored it, stopped it from leaving, like a hand catching a falling body by the wrist at the edge of a cliff. The world came back in fragments, stone ceiling above her, candlelight distant from the hall, the smell of herbs and blood and something else, something that cut through every other scent like a blade through silk, cedar and iron and winter wind, and underneath it, so faint she might have imagined it, the green-gold note of something growing, alive. She turned her head and found a face inches from hers, and the eyes that met hers were not human. They were wolf-pale, ringed with silver luminescence, and they held an expression she could not immediately decipher because no one had ever looked at her with it before. It was not tenderness. It was not desire. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that had nothing to do with having met before, and everything to do with biological imperative. Two systems reaching across the gap between failing bodies and finding, impossibly, the precise frequency that canceled out each other's fatal noise. His mouth left her shoulder. The bite mark he had left was not black. It was not decayed. It was raw and red and bleeding, which meant it was alive, which meant the tissue was responding, which meant her body had accepted the claim. The realization hit her in waves. First, she was not dead. Second, her heart was beating, still irregular but no longer spacing, no longer counting down, the intervals tightening like a fist closing around a lifeline. Third, there was a bond mark on her shoulder that was not Vorath's. It was new, it was uninvited, and it belonged to the man kneeling beside her in the servants' corridor of the royal palace. The silver circlet on his head catching the kitchen lamplight, the blood, her blood, on his lips. The king of Arranmore had claimed her, and she had not been conscious to consent. The first emotion that broke through the fog of pain and shock and biological upheaval was not gratitude. It was fury. White-hot, diamond-clear, the kind of fury that only someone who had already had her autonomy stripped once could produce when it happened again. She tried to sit up. Her body, traitor that it was, refused. But her voice worked, barely, a rasped whisper that carried enough venom to make the two healers step back. "What did you do?" It was not a question. It was an accusation, and she watched it land on the king's blood-smeared face with something that might have been surprise, as if he had expected gratitude, or shock, or unconsciousness, and had received instead the one response his 7 years of careful emotional suppression had not prepared him for. Honest rage from a woman who had every right to it. His jaw flexed. His wolf-bright eyes dimmed slightly, the luminescence retreating, and what was left was a man, a very large, very bloodied, very exposed man, kneeling on a kitchen floor and realizing for the first time the full scope of what he had just done. "I saved your life." And even as the words left his mouth, she watched him hear them, hear how insufficient they were, how they echoed with the particular arrogance of someone who believed the outcome justified the method. Her eyes held his. Her heartbeat, still finding its rhythm around the new mark on her shoulder, thudded once, hard, and she felt the nascent bond between them transmit something from her to him, something raw and unfiltered, and she watched his face change as he received it. It was not anger he felt from her, not exactly. It was the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had been treated as a vessel, a tool, a body to be used, first by the mate who harvested her, and now by the king who claimed her, and who had never, not once, been asked. She closed her eyes because keeping them open required strength she did not have, and the last thing she heard before unconsciousness pulled her under was his voice, stripped of authority, stripped of command, holding nothing but the raw, unpolished edge of a man confronting a mistake he could not undo. I know. I know. She woke in a room that smelled of lavender and beeswax, and for a disoriented moment she thought she was dead and the afterlife was surprisingly well furnished. The bed beneath her was wider than any surface she had ever slept on, the sheets softer than anything her hands had touched, and the pillow her head rested on was filled with something that released a faint herbal fragrance each time she moved. Her shoulder ached, a deep, persistent throb that was nonetheless categorically different from the consuming cold that had been killing her. This pain was productive, healing pain, the kind that meant tissue was knitting, systems were rebuilding. Her body was doing the laborious work of constructing new architecture around the bond mark that now occupied the space where Vorath's death sentence had been. She lay still for a long time, cataloging sensations. Her wolf was there, not restored but present, curled in the space behind her ribs like a wounded animal that had been pulled from the water and was not yet sure it was safe to uncurl. Her heartbeat was steady, her lungs expanded fully. Her fingers and toes, which had been numb for 2 days, tingled with returning circulation. She was alive. She was alive, and she had not chosen it. And the man who had chosen it for her was the most powerful wolf in the kingdom. And the bond between them, nascent and fragile and utterly uninvited, hummed in her chest like a plucked string. The door opened and a young woman entered carrying a tray, and behind her, moving with the particular cautious silence of a very large predator trying not to startle prey, came a child. The girl was perhaps 6, with enormous dark eyes and a cloud of curly hair, held back by a ribbon that was losing its battle. And she was carrying a stuffed wolf made of gray felt that had clearly been loved past the point of structural integrity. She stopped when she saw Senna was awake, and her face split into a grin that was missing 2 front teeth. "You are the lady the king bit!" The young woman with the tray, who Senna would later learn was Marin, one of the palace kitchen staff who had been assigned to monitor the king's inconvenient new problem, set the tray down and gave the child a look that accomplished nothing. "Lyra, we discussed using our gentle words." "I am using gentle words. I did not say he chomped her." Senna, against every rational impulse in her battered body, felt her mouth curve. It was small, more reflex than emotion, but it happened. And the child saw it and interpreted it as an invitation to climb onto the bed with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no. She settled herself cross-legged near Senna's hip, arranged her decrepit wolf on her lap, and studied Senna's face with an intensity that was unsettling from someone who had not yet mastered the art of tying her own shoes. "You look sad. Are you sad because the king bit you or because of the other thing?" Senna blinked. "What other thing?" "The other thing. The thing that made you smell like the cold. You still smell a little like it, but mostly you smell like the king now, which is better, because the king smells like trees." The child paused, considered, and added, "Good trees, not the scary ones." Merrin set a cup of broth on the bedside table and said, "Lyra is the daughter of Lord Fenwick's head of household. She has been staying in the palace while her mother recovers from an illness. She has also been told multiple times not to wander into the king's private wing." Lyra clutched her stuffed wolf and looked unrepentant. "Grim wanted to meet the lady. He says she smells right." Senna looked at the threadbare toy, at the child's enormous eyes, at the sunlight falling through the window onto sheets she had no right to be lying in, and something cracked in her chest that had nothing to do with the bond and everything to do with the simple, devastating reality of being treated as a person by a 6-year-old when the adults in her life had treated her as a commodity. She reached out, and her fingers, still clumsy with residual numbness, touched the felt wolf's lopsided ear. "Tell Grim thank you." The days that followed were a study in careful distance and unspoken negotiation. Kadrin did not visit. He sent healers. He sent food, good food, rich and restorative, the kind that rebuilt blood and bone and the biological scaffolding a bond required to take hold. He sent a woman named Thessaly, a court physician with steady hands and steadier eyes, who examined Senna's shoulder with clinical thoroughness, asked pointed questions about the timeline of Vorath's rejection, and, on the third day, sat on the edge of the bed and told Senna the truth about what had been done to her. Not the claiming. Senna understood the claiming. What Thessaly told her was worse. The deterioration of your original bond mark was not natural. The rate of energy loss, the pattern of tissue decay, the specific way your wolf consciousness was being suppressed. These are consistent with a parasitic drain. Someone was pulling your life force through the bond connection, using the mark as a conduit. Vorath did not reject you because he wanted you gone, Senna. He rejected you because the bond was the mechanism by which he was harvesting you. As long as it remained active and you remained near him, the extraction was invisible, slow, a gradual diminishment that could be attributed to a weak omega failing to thrive. The public rejection was not cruelty for its own sake. It was designed to accelerate the collapse, to crack the bond mark open so the energy could flow faster in the final days. He expected you to die quietly, somewhere far from him, and the last reserves of whatever he has been siphoning would come to him in one final rush. Senna listened, and the fury she had felt on the kitchen bench returned, but it was different now, colder, more architectural. Not the hot burst of violated autonomy, but the deep, structural anger of a woman who was beginning to understand that she had been livestock, that her mate, the man who had whispered words of tenderness against her hair, who had bitten her shoulder under a full moon while their pack howled blessings, had selected her not as a partner, but as a resource, and that the claiming mark now on her shoulder, the uninvited, unauthorized, desperately needed mark of a king she had never met, had done more than save her life. It had plugged the drain, cut the siphon, sealed the conduit through which Vorath had been feeding. Which meant, Senna realized, with a clarity that made her sit up straighter despite the pain, that Vorath knew. The moment Kadrin's mark took hold, the flow of energy would have stopped, and Vorath would have felt it like a hand closing over a pipe. He would know someone had claimed her. He would know the harvest was over. And he would come for her, because whatever he had been building with the power he stole, whatever purpose had driven him to drain his own bonded mate over months or years of careful, tender, devastating deception, he would not simply accept the loss. She looked at Thessaly and asked, "Does the king know?" Thessaly's expression was answer enough. He knew before he bit you. He could smell it, the extraction, the wrongness of it. And if Senna had needed proof that Kadron's claiming had been clinical rather than romantic, calculated rather than destined, the knowledge that he had identified a parasitic bond drain by scent and made the decision to intervene in the 60 seconds before her heart failed was, paradoxically, the most honest thing anyone had ever done for her. He had not chosen her. He had solved an equation in which her death was the wrong answer. And she could work with that. She could work with honest math when the alternative was beautiful lies. Kadron came to her on the 5th day, and she was ready for him. She had spent 2 days rebuilding herself with the single-minded determination of someone who had been pulled from a grave and intended to stay out of it. She had eaten everything Marin brought. She had let Thessaly monitor the bond mark's integration, endured the painful process of her wolf slowly, tentatively uncurling from its defensive retreat, and walked the length of the room 17 times until her legs stopped shaking. She had also, with Lyra's unwitting help, begun to understand the landscape she had been dropped into. The child visited daily, sometimes twice, always with Grim, the felt wolf, tucked under her arm, and she talked the way children talk, in sprawling, unedited narratives that contained more intelligence than any briefing a diplomat could provide. She talked about the king being sad even when he smiled. She talked about Lord Alluren, the first advisor, and how he smelled like metal and made her wolf feel prickly. She talked about the pretty ladies who had come for the ceremony and how they whispered about the Omega from the borders, the sick one, the broken one, the one the king had bitten like a stray. Senna absorbed all of it. The whispers did not wound her. She had been wounded by an expert, and court gossip was a paper cut compared to the evisceration Vorath had performed with a smile. When Kadron entered the room, he filled the doorway in a way that should have felt threatening and instead felt, through the nascent bond that hummed between them, like a door locking against a storm. He was not wearing the silver circlet. He was dressed simply, dark trousers, a gray tunic that did nothing to diminish the breadth of his shoulders or the sense that the room had suddenly become smaller. His face was carefully composed, but the bond, thin and fragile as it was, transmitted a current of emotion that he clearly had not anticipated she could read. Anxiety. Not the existential dread she might have expected from a king whose political position had just been catastrophically complicated, but the specific, almost endearing anxiety of a man who was about to have a conversation he did not know how to navigate. He stood near the door, maintaining distance, and she understood the choice, understood that he was trying to give her the space that he had failed to give her on the kitchen bench. Senna, and she heard it, the way his voice shaped her name, not as a caress, but as an acknowledgement, a concession that she was a person and not a problem. I owe you an explanation. You owe me several, he told her, all of it, the dual bloodline, the lethal bond architecture, the 7 years of refusal, the classified truth that his counsel had buried so deep that not even Alluren knew the full scope. He told her with the spare, clinical precision of someone accustomed to strategic briefings, and she listened. And when he was finished, she asked the question she had been holding since the moment she woke. Did it have to be you? He blinked. The question had caught him off guard, and she felt it through the bond, a flicker of confusion that he suppressed almost instantly. You are the only one who could have survived bonding with me. That is not what I asked. I asked if it had to be you. If there was time to explain, time to ask, time to give me the choice to die on my own terms rather than live on someone else's. The silence that followed was long enough to have texture. She watched him process it, watched the king's mask slip and the man beneath it grapple with a question that could not be answered with strategy or command. His wolf. She could feel it through the bond, was pressing forward, and she caught a fragment of its response, not words exactly, but an emotion so raw It made her breath catch. Grief. Not for himself. For her. For what he had taken without asking. No, there was not time. But that does not make it right, and I will not pretend that it does. She held his gaze, and the bond between them hummed, and she felt the first tentative stirring of something that was not forgiveness, but was adjacent to it. A recognition that this man, this impossible, compromised, brutally honest man, was the first person in her life who had admitted wrongdoing without immediately justifying it. That is a start. The weeks that followed built something between them that had no name in the old language, because the old language assumed bonds were chosen, and theirs had been a collision. Senna refused to move into the Queen's chambers. She stayed in the recovery room, which was technically a guest suite in the King's private wing, and the distinction mattered to her in ways she could not fully articulate, but that Kadrin, to his credit, did not challenge. He came to her each evening after council, and they talked, not about the bond, not about politics or duty, or the increasingly pointed whispers from the court about the King's inappropriate attachment to a Packless Omega. They talked about the things that existed beneath those surfaces. He told her about the first time his wolf had surfaced, at 12, and the joy of it, the absolute, singing rightness of becoming fully himself. And then the terror, 4 years later, when the royal physician sat him down and explained that the very thing that made him powerful was also the thing that would kill him if he ever tried to share it. She told him about Vorath, not the horror of the drain, but the years before it, the courtship, the way he had made her feel seen in a community where Omegas were furniture, the gentleness that had been bait on a hook, and the slow, imperceptible diminishment that she had attributed to her own weakness because he had so carefully, so lovingly, taught her that she was weak. They did not touch. The bond hummed between them constantly, a low-frequency awareness that transmitted emotion in broad strokes, and she felt his restraint like a physical force, the iron discipline of a man whose wolf was howling at him to close the distance, while his human conscience held the line she had drawn. One evening, 3 weeks after the claiming, Lyra appeared at the door with Grimm and a crown made of wildflowers she had clearly constructed herself, and announced that she was officiating a wedding. Kadrin, who was sitting in the chair across from Senna's, with the carefully maintained 6 feet of distance between them, looked at the child with an expression that Senna felt through the bond as a complex, layered thing, amusement and tenderness, and a grief that she understood instantly. The grief of a man who had believed he would never have this, would never sit in a room with a woman who did not want to kill him, and a child who was not afraid of him, would never be anything but the lonely, compromised king on the dais. Lyra, I am not certain that is how weddings work. It is how this one works. And she placed the wildflower crown on Senna's head with the careful solemnity of a priestess performing a sacred rite. Senna felt the petals brush her forehead, and the bond pulsed, and she looked at Kadrin across the 6 feet of careful distance and saw his wolf-pale eyes soften in a way that the bond translated for her as a single, aching word. Mine. Not possessive, not commanding. The mine of a man who had never been allowed to want anything, and was discovering, with the terrified wonder of someone touching fire for the first time, that he wanted this. The wildflower crown sat slightly askew on her head, and Lyra beamed, and Senna did not close the distance, but she smiled, and she felt, through the bond, the moment his heart broke open just enough to let her in. The attack came on a moonless night 6 weeks after the claiming, and it came from inside the palace. Senna woke to the sound of shattering glass and the smell of something that made her wolf recoil, a metallic, corrupted scent that she recognized in her marrow because it had lived in her shoulder for months. Vorath. Not here in person, not yet, but his work, his poison, the substance he had been refining from the energy he had stolen from her, a concentrated extract of parasitic bond corruption that could, if introduced to a living bond, reverse its formation and begin the drain anew. The vial had been thrown through the window of her room, and the liquid it contained was spreading across the stone floor in a pattern that hissed and smoked where it touched the wards Thessaly had laid. Senna rolled from the bed, her bare feet hitting cold stone, and in the same instant the door burst open, and a figure she recognized filled the frame. Lord Alluren, the first advisor. His face was calm, composed, wearing the same expression of professional competence he had maintained through decades of service, and in his hand he held a second vial of the same smoking substance. "You should have died quietly." He said it with the mild disapproval of a man addressing an administrative error. "The border packs serve a function, Omega. They produce what the Crown requires. Vorath's research was to be our greatest weapon against the Eastern Alliance, and your king, your inconvenient, sentimental king, has jeopardized 3 years of careful cultivation because he could not control his broken biology." Senna stared at him, and the pieces fell into place with the sickening clarity of a puzzle she had been too close to see. Alluren, not Vorath alone. Vorath had been the tool, the mechanism, the willing hand that performed the harvest. But the architect, the one who had identified Senna's rare bloodline energy as a resource worth cultivating, the one who had arranged her placement with Vorath, the one who had designed the slow extraction and planned the quiet death, was the man who had stood at the king's left hand for 20 years. She had been bred for this, selected as a child, placed with a handler, and milked like livestock to fuel a weapon she would never see. Alluren stepped into the room, and behind him, 2 guards whose scents were wrong, corrupted, tinged with the same metallic wrongness, moved to flank the door. Cadron, she felt through the bond, his sudden alertness, the explosive surge of protective fury as her fear transmitted across the connection, and then pain, sharp and disorienting, and she understood that elsewhere in the palace, someone was engaging him, distracting him, buying time for Alluren to finish what Vorath had started. The advisor raised the vial. "This will dissolve the king's mark, and then the drain will resume, faster this time, enough to fuel the weapon before your body gives out entirely. A waste, truly. You were meant to last another year." He said it with regret, genuine regret, the regret of a craftsman whose materials had been mishandled. And Senna, standing barefoot on cold stone in a borrowed nightgown with a bond mark that was barely 2 months old on her shoulder, felt something ignite. Not fury, not fear, something deeper, something that had been coiled in her bloodline for generations, sleeping, waiting, passed from mother to daughter in a line so old that even the families who carried it had forgotten what it was. The golden warmth started in her chest and radiated outward, and she did not command it, did not understand it, did not try to shape or aim it. It simply answered the need. It answered the terror of a woman who had been harvested and used and discarded, and who was, for the first time in her life, refusing. The light that poured from her hands was not fire, it was purification. It hit the corrupted liquid on the floor and unmade it, not burning it, but dissolving the corruption itself, leaving clean stone behind. It hit the 2 guards and they staggered, the wrongness in their scent evaporating like mist in sunlight, and they collapsed, unconscious but alive, the parasitic influence that had been controlling them purged in an instant. Alluren threw the second vial, and the light caught it in midair, and the glass dissolved, and the liquid vaporized, and the advisor stood in a room full of golden radiance, facing an Omega who had been told her entire life that she was nothing. And the expression on his face, the first honest expression she had ever seen him wear, was terror. You are a Sunblood. The light pulsed once more, a protective barrier that sealed the room, and Senna felt her knees buckle, felt the cost of the power drawing against reserves she did not know she had, and in the instant before she fell, the door behind Alluren exploded inward, and Kadrin was there. He was bleeding from a wound on his arm that smoked with the same metallic corruption, and his eyes were fully wolf, no humanity left in them, and he moved with a speed that should not have been possible for a man his size. He did not kill Alluren. He wanted to. Senna felt it through the bond, the savage, absolute desire to end the man who had orchestrated the torture of his mate. And the word came without hesitation now. Mate. The bond recognizing what her conscious mind had been negotiating for weeks. But he did not kill him, because Senna, falling, spent the last of her golden light not on a weapon, but on a thought, transmitted through the bond with everything she had. Do not become what they made me. Let him answer for it. Let it be justice, not vengeance. Kadrin caught her before she hit the floor. His arms closed around her, and the bond between them, strengthened by what she had just done, blazed with a warmth that was not golden light, but was the same substance, the same ancient bloodline power that had been sleeping in her, now recognized, now named, now awake. He held her against his chest, and his wolf howled, not in rage but in recognition, and the sound that came from his human throat was a word she had waited her entire life to hear spoken, without conditions. Mate. Alluren was seized by guards whose loyalty had never been corrupted. He would face the ancient laws, public accusation, public judgment, exile or execution determined by the evidence of his own meticulous records. Vorath, his supply cut, his patron exposed, his weapon unfueled, would be found 3 days later in a border settlement, his body consuming itself as the stolen energy he had hoarded turned toxic without the stabilizing mechanism Alluren had promised him. Poetic, inevitable. The scheme eating its architect, the harvest rotting in the silo. But that was later. In this moment, there was only the stone floor of a room in the king's private wing, and a man holding a woman he had claimed without permission, and who had just saved him without being asked, and the golden light fading from her hands as she pressed her face against his chest and breathed in cedar and iron and winter wind and growing things. She chose him on a morning in late autumn, and she did it on her own terms. The ceremony was not the grand public spectacle the court had expected. It was held in the palace garden, beneath a tree so ancient that its roots had cracked the original foundation stones, and the only witnesses were Thessaly, Marin, a handful of guards whose loyalty had been proven in fire, and Lyra, who served as flower girl with a seriousness that bordered on ferocity, and who had insisted that Grim the felt wolf be given a seat of his own. Senna wore a simple dress, cream-colored, and the wildflower crown that Lyra had made her weeks ago, reconstructed with fresh blooms for the occasion. Her shoulder was bare, the bond mark visible, healed now into a clean crescent that hummed with warmth rather than cold. And when she walked toward Kadrin across the garden path, she did it with her eyes open and her wolf steady behind her ribs, and her hand unclenching, for the first time, from the fist she had been making since Vorath first whispered that she was his. The claiming ceremony required words, old words, the ones carved into the walls of the grand hall, the ones that had been spoken over unions for 1,000 years. But the tradition assumed a new bond, a first bond, and theirs was neither. So Senna wrote new words, and when she spoke them, standing before a king who was looking at her with wolf-pale eyes that held not possession but a question, she felt the bond between them stop humming and start singing. I was claimed without my voice. I was harvested without my knowledge. I was broken by a man who wore love like a mask, and I was saved by a man who did not pretend to be gentle. I stand here now not because I was chosen, but because I choose. I choose the bond that was forced, and the man who forced it, and the life that was stolen and returned and rebuilt. I choose this, not because it was fated, because it is mine. Kadrin's hands, enormous and capable, and trembling in a way that only she could feel through the bond, took hers, and his voice, that low, rough, controlled voice that spoke in commands and vows, broke on the first word. He did not give a speech. He was not capable of one. You are my answer, Senna, and I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of the question. Lyra clapped. Grim fell off his chair. The ancient tree dropped the cascade of golden leaves that caught the autumn light and fell around them like a benediction from a world that had been watching, waiting, holding its breath for exactly this. He kissed her beneath the falling leaves, and it was not the desperate, life-saving press of his mouth on her shoulder in the servants' corridor. It was slow and deliberate and thorough, a man finally permitted to want. And she kissed him back with the full weight of a woman who had chosen this, every complicated, imperfect, uninvited inch of it. And the bond between them settled into something so deep and so steady that it felt less like a thread and more like a foundation, like a root, like the bones of the ancient tree above them, reaching into the earth and holding fast. 3 years later, on a morning in early spring, Senna stood in the garden beneath the same tree and watched Kadrin attempt to negotiate with a 2-year-old who had inherited his father's stubbornness and his mother's talent for quiet defiance. Their son, Alder, named for the tree that had witnessed their choosing, was sitting in a patch of sunlight with his arms folded and his lower lip extended in a display of protest so dignified it would have been appropriate at a council session. He did not want to put on shoes. He had opinions about shoes. Kadrin, king of Aranmore, commander of 12 legions, survivor of a biology that should have killed him, was losing the argument. Senna leaned against the tree and watched with an expression of serene neutrality that was, through the bond, broadcasting undisguised delight. Alder, shoes are not optional. They are not optional, but they are wrong. Kadrin looked at Senna. Help. She crossed the garden and knelt beside her son, and his wolf, already present, already aware, already as opinionated as his father's, pressed against the inside of his small ribs and hummed at her approach. Your father is right. Shoes are not optional. But those shoes are too small. You have grown. Kadrin stared at the shoes, stared at his son's feet, stared at Senna with an expression of such profound, offended realization that the bond between them vibrated with it. They are too small. When did they become too small? Last week. I ordered new ones. They arrived today. I was waiting to see how long it took you to notice. Through the bond, she felt the cascade of his response, exasperation and admiration, and a love so steady and so vast that it had long since ceased to be an emotion and had become a climate, the atmospheric condition of their shared life, the weather they lived in. She felt his wolf, no longer suppressed, no longer caged, rumble with contentment so deep it was almost subsonic. And she felt, as she felt every morning, the mark on her shoulder hum with warmth, the steady pulse of a bond that had been forced and chosen and tested and rebuilt, a bond that was not fate and not accident, but the deliberate, daily, stubborn decision of two people who had every reason to be broken and had chosen, instead, to be a foundation. Lyra appeared at the garden gate, breathless, trailing a ribboned catastrophe of what appeared to be a kite shaped like a wolf. Grim learned to fly. He did not. Maren called from somewhere inside the palace, in the tone of someone who had seen the trajectory. Alder abandoned the shoe dispute immediately, in favor of this vastly more interesting development, and ran barefoot across the garden toward Lyra, with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had never known the cold, who had been born into warmth, who carried light in his blood, and his mother's defiance in his jaw, and his father's steadiness in his gait. Kadrin rose and stood beside Senna beneath the tree, and his hand found hers, and they watched their son chase a felt wolf on a string through the spring sunlight, and the bond between them was quiet, in the way that only truly safe things are quiet. The silence of a house with good walls, and a strong roof, and a fire that someone pens. I would do it again. And she knew he meant the kitchen bench, the bite, the unconsented claiming that had started everything. She squeezed his hand. I know. And then, because she was Senna, and the bone-deep honesty between them was the thing she valued most, she added, but next time, ask. He looked down at her, and the wolf-pale eyes that had terrified a court and commanded a kingdom crinkled at the corners, and the smile that broke across his scarred face was the rarest thing in Arryn more precious than sun-blood power or ancient laws, the unguarded, unrehearsed, completely human smile of a man who had been saved by the woman he had saved, and who had spent every day since trying to deserve it. There will be no next time. There is only you. Alder shrieked with laughter as the kite caught a gust, and Grim, the felt wolf, achieved brief, glorious, improbable flight, and Lyra cheered, and somewhere in the palace, Maren sighed, and began preparing for the inevitable first aid that accompanied all of Lyra's engineering projects. And the spring sun fell through the ancient branches and painted the garden gold. So, rate this story 1 to 10. Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want the extended epilogue, where we learn what happened to Vorath's research and who Lyra grows up to marry, hit that subscribe button